Minnesota, Toronto. Go.
Fantastic news for the Blue Jays. Every day we have a research packet sent to us by MLB Network researchers. And the other day, Richard Deitch was quoted in it. I'm like, wow, you guys are digging deep here. Not often do they use quotes from columnists, but it was right after the Jays Rangers, the third of the 4-game sweep. And they had Deitch's quote from The Athletic where Rich had said, in the years that I've been here, this is the most frustrating Blue Jays team I've seen so far. Boos heard everywhere. They're a team that's probably going to the playoffs around 90 wins, and yet everyone's disappointed, and I understand their frustration. And in looking at the record yesterday, I'm like, that's crazy that they're an 89-win team. If you told me at the start of the year, I'm like, oh, Jays are pushing 95 wins, contending for the AL East instead of 89 wins, final wild card. But fantastic news because they get to avoid the Rays and face the Minnesota Twins. I know some would say, well, be careful what you wish for. Twins are still a playoff team. They're the worst team in the playoffs. We all know they're an 87-win team in a bad division. And I'll take the cupcakes as I can and then reload when I have to face better teams, whether it's the Orioles, the Rangers, the Astros. So great news for the Jays. They lose the final game of the season. You get to save Gossman. Obviously, he can now pitch in game 1 on Tuesday. And also, just because my TV brain won't let me stop from doing this, I was just talking to one of my neighbors down the street. He said, how about the fact these matchups? He goes, the Phillies are in prime time. I said, yeah. I go, because there's no Yankees, there's no Mets. I'm like, I just laugh, like, as a former ESPN employee at them looking at the schedule going, all right, what do we got here? What's the big TV? Okay, Rays. Oh my God, no, they draw flies. Okay, forget that. Rangers, Rays. Put them at 3:00 ABC. Jays. Oh God, Toronto, no, the Canadian team that never draws well. Twins. We got 4:30 ESPN. Okay, great. D-backs, Brewers. Oh my God, Milwaukee, one of the smallest markets in the world. D-backs. Nobody cares about football. ESPN 2. All right, that means Phillies in primetime, even though the Marlins are a team that doesn't have a great fan base either. So I can't wait to watch all 4 games. Of course, I'm a baseball nut, and I love every game. But good news, at least for the Blue Jays. I'll be able to watch all those games. 4:30 Eastern, pretty good. Everybody at home. If you're working at CIBC, you're working a little 8 to 4, get home, you'll be able to watch the Blue Jays and Twins series.
I mean, I don't even know how to follow this. All right, a couple things here. All right, first off, it's incredible the amount of podcasts that Adnan Virk not only has, but goes on. It's like one of those guests in the 80s who you'd see on,
Johnny Carson.
Not just Carson, because Carson usually would like throw you off if you ever appeared on another show.
Correct.
Adnan's like the guy who appears on like the Mike Douglas show, the Joe Franklin show, and all the the B-level podcasts that are out there.
Hold on. Are you suggesting that this is a B-level podcast?
Yes. Not only suggesting it, I'm absolutely putting it out there.
But so Rich, in fairness, nobody more open to doing a podcast than Jeff Pearlman. Jeff Pearlman,
true.
Your SI former
colleague. We had on as well.
He's openly said, if you get me, I will never say no to a podcast. He's incredible.
Secondly, my reporting says that Adnan is only doing this podcast prior to doing a tennis match in a couple hours. So that's what my reporting has shown as well. But here's, in all seriousness, here is something I do want to ask you, Adnan.
Yeah.
Things about the Blue Jays, and I did say that they really have been a confounding, frustrating team because they the sum of their parts is not as good this year, has not been as good this year as the individual talent that exists. My question for you, as someone obviously who has watched more baseball than I have and is really into it, is it possible for a team to just sort of flip the switch in the playoffs? Like we sometimes sort of have that cliche, because if ever the sort of time was needed for a team to do that, like if the Blue Jays actually over the next month sort of provided the fan base with what you think this team is, they are a legit World Series contender. The question is, can you, like, you know what I'm saying? Like, can you turn it on all of a sudden? Because that has not been the case this year.
I think you can, Rich. In the past, you saw Rocktober, of course, the Rockies very famously against your wife's Red Sox, actually. Yeah. Ended up falling flat in the World Series, but had an amazing run. Last year, the Phillies, they were not a 90-win team like Toronto. Correct. Caught fire, pulled off a few upsets. Harper's immortal home run against the Padres. So I do think you can do it in baseball, and especially with the playoff format is now, these teams feel like if you can get 85, 86 wins, just get into the dance, pull off a run, you can pull it off. Specifically for Toronto, what gives them hope amidst what I agree with you has been a generally disappointing season is what plays in the playoffs, power bats and power arms. And the Jays certainly have that. When you look at their team, you go, okay, can they hit home runs? Yes, they can, because of Vlad and Bichette and Chapman and Kirk and all the rest of it. And in power arms, specifically, I look at that bullpen and I say, you know what, late in the game, I can go to Hicks, who throws 105. I got Swanson, who's been a great setup guy. Good trade there for Teoscar Hernandez. And of course, Romano, who was second in the league in saves. And that's holding the prize jewel of this team, which is their starting pitching. Like,
Right.
it's shocking. Their starting pitching is the best in baseball. Their ERA, never better. Gossman's a top 5 Cy guy, led the league in strikeouts. Barrios, huge bounce back season. Bassett's a 16-game winner, much better at home than he is on the road. Kikuchi, a pleasant surprise, even if he stumbled in September. And Ryu's a guy who obviously had great seasons with the Dodgers, pretty good option to have out of the bullpen. So I do think that, Rich, if you look at them, you go, that's surprising. They're an 89-win team. They should have won 95, but can they put together come playoff time? Yeah. And specifically against Minnesota, again, the draw, the Twins have lost 18 straight playoff games. Now, a lot of those were at the hands of the New York Yankees. But again, Correa's coming in limping. Buxton's coming in limping. Not sure if either of those guys are going to play. Royce Lewis was their best hitter in September. He's been injured. So Minnesota is a wounded opponent, specifically offensively. The Jays should win 2 games and go on to the next round. And after that, who knows what can happen.
Well, the one thing, and it's almost the opposite of the Minnesota scenario, is that the Blue Jays are coming in relatively healthy,
right?
Yeah.
Compared to the other teams. And even if they had played Tampa, they were going to be more healthy than Tampa. But I'm concerned about Jordan Romano. I mean, he has not had a good second half of September. Whether it's being put in positions late in games, even if they haven't got the lead, and he's in the bottom of the ninth and can't close. That to me is the biggest concern they have right now. The starting pitching, you're right. I mean, our old pal John Gibbons has been saying for 2 months, just get in, because they have better pitching than anybody. And they did that. But to me, the biggest concern might be Jordan Romano, Adnan.
Yeah, I have to hope then, John, it's more than a 1-run lead, because I'm with you. Closers can always be fickle by nature. And Romano was great in the first half of the year. By the way, talked to him at the All-Star game in Seattle. I said, okay, you got to solve the eternal mystery of life. Is it Romano or Romano? Because I said, Dan Schulman calls you Romano. So Dan Schulman has to be right, but it's Ray Romano. So like, which one is it? And he goes, well, it's funny you said Ray Romano. He said, in America, it's Romano. It's Canada, it's Romano. And
That's the Canadian thing.
Right. So, but I'm Canadian working in America. So what should I use? He goes, well, if you're working in America, you probably go with Romano. And I go, now I'm really confused. But anyways, we'll stick with Romano for this Canadian podcast.
What's the difference between Nissan and Nissan? Because in Canada, it's a Nissan car, but in the United States, it's a Nissan car.
Right. Michael Kim, legendary ESPN anchor, one of Richard Dykes' favorites, said to me, he goes, I knew your name was pronounced Adnan. I said, why? He goes, because you guys say Mike Medano. And in America, they say Mike Madonna.
Right.
All right. Fair enough. For Romano, hasn't been the same as you said, John, since the All-Star break. Wasn't 100% healthy. It gets tricky with closers, right? Because you get so used to being in an identifiable role. I can't imagine a situation where John Schneider would say, 9th inning, 1-run game, let me try Swanson. Let me try Hicks. Like, no, Romano's our guy. So it's a fair point to say, hey, he hasn't been as great recently, but kind of like to Rich's point with the team, you kind of just hope you can flip the switch and he can go back to being the All-Star closer he's been. On the topic of closers, just because there gets so much scrutiny and focus around them, the fact that Josh Hader and the Padres flickering playoff hopes late in the year, the fact he would not pitch in a 4-out save just made me think how ludicrous that is. What a tough spot to put your manager in. So at the very least, Romano's a guy who will take the ball. If they need a 4-out save, fine. Maybe he hasn't been as strong recently, but closers by nature can be tricky to deal with. And you're right. If you have, and especially in a short series, a best of 3 against Minnesota, if they suffer a catastrophic loss, that'd be a problem. And of course, nobody wants to think about what happened last year when they blew that 7-run lead against Seattle.
Well, the good news is for them, at least for me, is the way the team is constructed this year. They're much better set up pitching wise for the playoffs because they have brought in power arms in the bullpen who can swing and miss, and they've extended their lane. So even like someone like Chad Green can now come in the 6th inning, let's say, if the starters are really struggling, and give you something. You mentioned Hicks, obviously, who's been excellent. I think Romano, when he's got a little bit of rest, is still nails and lights out. I think that was sort of the issue this week. But if you just think about the bullpen, Adnan, you really could bridge it from, let's say you get 5 quality innings from your starter, and let's hope that Gausman goes longer. Mm-hmm. But between Green, Jimmy Garcia, Jordan Hicks, Jordan Romano, Eric Swanson, that's 5 legit arms you can bring in almost any leverage situation to get you home. That's something they did not have last year. So I bring all this up because it gets back to, I think, what you said at the beginning of this, power bats. They have to hit. That's where the entire year has sort of been just an inexplicable, odd year. You know, you expected more from Varsho. Matt Chapman has not had a good year. Let's just he's been brutal in terms of a guy who you thought was going to come in and have one of these years where, you know, go into free agency and, you know, get like $300 million or whatever. So that to me is really the key for this entire team is if they can hit, then they become a really interesting playoff team, but so John has watched every game. I've watched like pretty much every game. I know you've watched a lot of them. And so often the Blue Jays, it's like 1-0 or 0-0 in the 5th inning, and you're like, you're always playing essentially like 1-run baseball, which is very, very hard, like stress-wise and mentally, to eventually win. So that's what I hope from them. Is I'd love to see just in the 1st or 2nd or 3rd inning them putting up a 5 spot and just making life comfortable for their pitchers to get it home.
Yeah, that's what's so frustrating, Rich. When you looked at this team at the start of the year, the first thing people start with is the offense. Naturally, you say, well, with Vlad Jr., with Bo Bichette, and then you just start listing off the names. You go, oh, they're going to score runs no matter what. I'm like, no, actually, it was the real issue.
Yeah.
You mentioned Varsho specifically. He's interesting because he's so good defensively. You look at the metrics, defensive run save, he's off the charts. And that's what the Jays did focus on, was run prevention. So if you have an outfield of Varsho, Kiermaier, and Springer from defensive run save, they're elite. But I'm with you. Runs are so precious to come by. Do I put Whit Merrifield in left field? Do I have Davis Schneider at second base and maybe sacrifice a bit of defense for offense? I think Varsho's OPS plus is like 93. Like when you're below league average, that's concerning. And Chapman, first month, he got off to an incredible start. He was like the April MVP, which is even more shocking. When I look at his numbers, I think he had like 16 home runs for the year. And you go, wait a second. Chapman's a guy, started his career still elite defensively, but hit for power, hit for average. Then he stopped hitting for average, but still hit 30 home runs. Now he doesn't have power or average, and he's still elite defensively. And as you said, a walk year, he was gunning for $200 million. Now he may not even get $100 million. So I think the big one, too, as you guys know, being in Toronto, the talk around Vlad Jr., and you look specifically at his work against 4-seamers, it just had trouble with high velo. And that was a problem. But I give Vlad credit. In September, I thought he stepped up when need be. I thought George Springer stepped up when need be, even though he has had a disappointing season. So, and of course, Bo Bichette was banged up a little bit, but in many ways is the heartbeat of that team. So those two guys, Kirk's another guy. You look at his numbers, he's below 100 OPS plus, but a real shock how poor he's been defensively. And offensively hasn't stepped up. Like when they dealt Moreno, you're like, okay, well, Kirk's a great guy. Jansen's good. Jansen's a pop, then he got hurt. I do think Brandon Belt, under the radar, sneaky good season.
I agree.
Like that's a guy no one's really talked about. Brandon Belt's been in many ways their second best hitter, so he's really been special for them.
What's interesting is like the reason they're in the playoffs is because a couple of guys bailed them out at different times of the year. Belt bailed them out for a couple wins, and Davis Schneider obviously essentially won that Red Sox series.
Yeah,
really gets him in. But this is where it's just the team is confounding because and Biggio maybe won one or two games by getting hot. Those are 3 of those guys. That's not the core of the team. Yeah. And that's where it's just been so frustrating this year.
Well, there's a good chance that, Biggio may not start. There's a good chance Schneider may not start. I mean, I think Merrifield goes to second. I think the outfield
depends on the pitcher. I would not. I don't think I'm with you on Davis Schneider, but if I would try to get Biggio's bat in the lineup, he's had a great September if you can do it.